From food insecurity to rising inflation, from the infrastructure gap to the risks of war, the African business community is coming together at the annual Africa CEO Forum to tackle these critical issues.
Hi, I'm Eleni Jokos in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and I'll be speaking to top CEOs and business leaders about how boosting intra-Africa trade can help alleviate some of the challenges the continent is facing.
As Africans, we have to take ownership of our development.
We need to create a primary food processing industry in Africa.
Africa is critical for the 21st century. I think this is the starting point.
Abidjan, the economic capital of Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. This city, famous for its busy seaport, crowded traditional markets and extensive infrastructure, has established itself as an attractive economic and financial hub in the region. Here you will find major international banks and leading multinationals. Today, Abidjan is a destination for thousands of African CEOs and entrepreneurs.
Bonjour, monsieur. Bienvenue à vous.
They're descending onto the city for the Africa CEO Forum, the largest business conference on the continent, also known as the Davos of Africa, and one of the first in-person events since the pandemic broke out 2 years ago. An opportunity to network and discuss the challenges the continent is facing.
Hello, everyone.
For me, it's a chance to finally get back onto the road to talk business and to see old friends. When the COVID pandemic hit in 2020, the African continent saw its worst recession in more than 50 years. GDP fell by 2.1%, with foreign direct investment and exports taking an even harder hit, plummeting 16% and 8.5% respectively. And as the continent is rebuilding post-pandemic, intra-African trade currently represents around 15% of total trade, could be the big winner.
I think one of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic is the fact that we need each other as African countries. You know, at some point, some of our businesses were suffering, but some of our businesses were thriving because of the lack of imports elsewhere, from elsewhere in the world. So I think it has proved the fact that we can create and build capacity amongst Africans to trade with each other.
The first shock of COVID, the second one was the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. So definitely in terms of food security, in terms of energy security, and all those stuff we've been discussing all throughout the period, it's sort of important for now that African countries sort of build a capacity system, trading between themselves, to sort of strengthen the resilience.
So from a trade perspective, you can imagine we don't have necessarily the connectivity on trade. So I think by opening that area up, then the continent should be able to expand and trade within itself and create more value.
The future of Africa is for us to export to each other's countries, to manufacture for each other, and not rely on the West.
COVID-19, geopolitical instability, and inflation. The past 2 years have put Africa under huge pressure. The hundreds of CEOs and officials that I'm meeting here are heeding the call to find joint solutions to long-standing issues like poverty, food insecurity, the infrastructure gap, and low economic growth.
We've seen an enormous increase in inequality because of the pandemic. And I guess the fear is now, with new geopolitical issues that is causing supply chain problems with food as well as energy, what that would mean for inequality on the continent. Could you put that into numbers for us?
I mean, inequality has gotten worse, right? It's interesting, you know, even when we had strong growth, so we talk about Africa rising, the reality is we've had a rising decade. So the middle decade, 2000 to 2010 is when we really rose. The last 10 years have been quite difficult. But even when we were rising as a continent, the number of people living in poverty increased, it didn't decrease, right? And so what's happening is, yes, we're getting growth of 5%, 6%. It's interesting, but in a continent where population is growing at 2.7%, it doesn't give you much wiggle room.
So what is going to move the needle on that? Is there a silver bullet?
I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I think there are a couple of things that we need to get right. One is the problems everywhere, so you need to prioritize where you're going to focus and what are the ones that are really going to move the needle for you. I think where the rubber hits the road and where we failed, generally, if we're honest with ourselves as a continent, is execution. How do you track, monitor, course correct, fix what's going on, figure out where you are, and then start to make sure that things are moving in the right direction.
The African private sector is now seen as crucial to unlocking the continent's full potential. Here at the Africa CEO Forum, business leaders are calling for investments in infrastructure, health, finance, energy and housing. All sectors in which the African Finance Corporation, a large multilateral institution that wants to tackle the infrastructure gap, is working on for the post-pandemic recovery of the continent.
I guess the question is now, is the continent, are various African leaders ready to pump in the right amount of money that is required to fill that gap?
So, as Africans, we have to take ownership of our development. And the African Finance Corporation is an example of Africans taking ownership of development and challenges facing the continent. So what we have always needed is private sector participation and the ability to mobilize additional private sector capital for infrastructure investments and for most of the things that we need to happen on the continent. And that is a challenge. We need to have more Africans taking charge, leading the investments, and the world will follow.
I want to talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area. And, there's so much excitement about it. And frankly, we have a show, that we're focusing on sort of the impact. Have you seen an impact? Has it changed the way that you've been able to engage with the players on the continent?
It will provide us an avenue to trade the goods that we produce in Africa. So one of the key focus for AFC is to transform African resources into finished goods. So we have a project in Gabon whereby we're transforming timber into furniture, sawwood, plywood, and veneer, and we want to do that at scale. We have a project in Benin Republic where we're going to transform cotton and cashew into finished products. You must have goods that you can trade within the Continental Free Trade Area. We think that if we can make progress with regional integration, we can make progress with customs, we can make program with visas and travel, then we'll be on the path.
What exactly is economic sovereignty and how can it be achieved? After the break, we discuss that with one of the continent's top industrialists. Economic sovereignty, being more independent when it comes to producing more goods and services, has been widely discussed here at the Africa CEO Forum.
The questions are how to achieve it, what would the impact be, and what would economic independence really look like?
Africa's trade deficit today sits at $125 billion. If you compare that to, it's sort of 4 times the deficit of Europe, it's 1.5 times the deficit of Asia. And what that means is we just import too many of our products, right? We import 99% of our vaccines, we import 60% of our pharmaceuticals products, we import 71% of the wheat we consume, right? And as such, we're overly dependent on other countries.
Abdul Samad Rabiu is a billionaire industrialist at the helm of Boer Group, a Nigerian conglomerate in food processing and infrastructure. He believes that Africa can finally end its dependency on European and Asian countries. And he told me that the tool to gain economic sovereignty is the African Continental Free Trade Area.
So, our African Continental Free Trade Area, what has been the in real terms, impact for your business since it went live? Have you had anything change?
To be honest, yes, we have. The African Continental Free Trade Arrangement is an amazing arrangement. It needs to we need to all come together to ensure that it works for us to really, enjoy the benefits of the agreement. Of course, we also have challenges as far as infrastructure is concerned, because for the agreement to succeed, you need to also fix infrastructure space. And these are areas like ports, for example. It is more expensive.
Are you still finding it challenging?
We are finding challenges
to use
the ports. I give you an example. It is more expensive to ship goods from Nigeria, say, to Lomé than from Nigeria to Brazil.
Based in Nigeria, Bua is one of the largest conglomerates in Africa. Its business spans across food, cement, real estate, mining, and port operations. In 2021, it spun off and listed its food and cement units, obtaining high profits despite economic challenges and the infrastructure gap. And with the AfCFTA allowing tax-free trade on thousands of food items, Rabiu is investing more to achieve independency in the food business, cutting imports from outside the continent and trading more with Africa.
You know, we are also into sugar, and we are building the most advanced sugar plantation in Nigeria today, because we've been importing raw sugar to process in Nigeria. So we started, this plantation about, 3 years ago. And it's a 20,000 hectare, 4-in-1, fully integrated, sugar plantation, with sugar mill, sugar refinery, ethanol, and power plant. We decided to do that because we realized that we are spending a lot of money importing, raw sugar, and sugar is something that, easily could be planted and produced in Nigeria.
So what do you want to invest in other than sugar, right? Are you thinking grains? Are you thinking...
Grains is key. Okay, we are doing, because most of our businesses actually, we are getting a lot of our raw materials locally, like our cement business or mining business. We have 7 plants scattered across Nigeria, and some of these plants are actually within some border towns, which means we can locally sell and also export. So most of those plants are using almost 90 to 95% locally sourced raw materials.
If there's one thing that large and small corporations have proven over the pandemic, is that they are resilient and agile. After the break, how Africa plans to tackle food insecurity.
In Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, business leaders and CEOs have gathered to discuss some of the biggest opportunities and challenges for Africa.
Food security is widely talked about here, and with 60% of Africa's population still reliant on agriculture as a source of income, it is absolutely vital.
Yet the continent is a net importer of food. It is 60% of the world's arable land, but imports $35 billion of its food consumption. And according to the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, that number could hit $110 billion by 2025.
When you look at the way we import food on the African continent, you see that we import things like staples, maize, rice, wheat. These are things that can be produced on the African continent, and yet we export unprocessed goods like cocoa, like coffee, like horticulture. So really what we aren't doing today is investing to make sure we can increase the production of key staples on the continent, which are integral to what people eat. We need larger commercial, also economies of scale to make sure that we're making food production in a way that's affordable.
Helping farmers across Africa to become more efficient and productive is the mission of Ikenna Mzewi. This young Nigerian businessman launched his company Relief to industrialize the production of key products like nuts, oil palm, and vegetable oil, increasing crop yields and contributing to tackling food insecurity.
So Relief is a supply chain technology company. Basically, it's our job to make sure that fast-moving consumer good companies get the inputs for their products at cheaper prices. And so to do that, we need to create a primary food processing industry in Africa. And so we are creating that network in Africa by creating new pieces of technology that do this primary processing, and also using geospatial software to figure out where the best location for those factories should be to make the value chain more efficient.
Take me through the value chain that you're plugged into right now.
So we've started off in the sustainable oil palm sector. We work with smallholder farmers. So if you look at the vegetable oil market in Nigeria, 80% of the supply comes from about 4 million smallholder farmers, and the other 20% comes from more monoculture, plantation-based oil palm. And so what our company does is we work with smallholder farmers to basically process their nuts into vegetable oil, and we sell it to FMCGs. So to take you on the journey from the farm, it all starts with the palm fruit. So farmers climb palm trees and cut down the palm fruit. They then squeeze the juice out of the palm fruit. Today, smallholder farmers will use like handheld rocks to basically crack open these nuts, which is very time intensive, and it of course ruins the quality of the resulting vegetable oil from that nut. And so at Relief, we invented a nut cracker. My CTO invented it and I gave it a name, so because it cracks nuts, we call it Kraken. It's 200 times faster than a smallholder farmer processing the crops themselves, and it saves farmers the trouble of having to process these crops in a way that reduces value from the value chain.
Do you work with a lot of smallholder farmers that then plug into a wider sort of value chain? How do they get your goods to market?
So I think in general, we've chosen a good crop. Vegetable oil has incredible demand in West Africa, and so Nigeria's vegetable oil market is over $3 billion, and analysts estimate that there's twice as much demand as there is readily available supply. And so the demand is there for the product, and I think the development community is even beginning to re-envision the point that you were just making. If the intervention should be from looking for products that have high demand and then stimulating those value chains, or working from the supply side to increase yields, but maybe not being sure if those yields will be sold. And so our approach at Relief is to really start with strong demand from these FMCGs that need these inputs, and then to help smallholder farmers get access to that market.
The Continental Free Trade Area has been, as a policy, is really interesting, right? Because we want to see more intra-Africa trade. You're focusing on the Nigerian market right now. Do you think that there's a lot more opportunity for the rest of the continent?
There's a ton of opportunity.
And can you tap into it realistically?
Yeah, so when we look at crops, we look at the crops over a multi-country geographical area. We don't just choose Nigerian oil palm. We choose West and Central African oil palm as an investment strategy. And as I mentioned earlier with our business, we use geospatial technology to position these nutcrackers where there is farming activity. And so it's very easy for us to expand and basically say, oh, there's a great location in Ghana where farmers are very productive, but they don't have access to market. Let's put a nutcracker there.
The scars of the pandemic, inflation and conflict, the world is dealing with a plethora of challenges. We ask the question how African businesses can build buffers to protect against exogenous shocks.
Inflation, wars, food insecurity have put Africa under stress these past 2 years. Here at the Africa CEO Forum, I'm now preparing to go on stage and discuss with top bankers how the continent can build buffers to protect itself from future global shocks.
I think that, if we think about the inflationary impact, we think about the prognosis from the World Bank or the OECD, we're not heading into recession just yet, but it is a scary scenario that we're looking at, and it almost feels Sisyphean. One crisis happens and then we're barely out of, that unprecedented experience, and we're heading into another unknown factor. So given the macroeconomic environment, what are bankers doing right now to change our scenarios?
Those are old problems for Africa. Those issues are old issues. We know that Africa has a limited fiscal space. We know that we need to move up into the value chain in terms of agriculture. We know that we have not been invested that much into agriculture for a long time. All those issues are old issues. The only thing that is new today is this is once again reminding us that we need to act. We need to deal with those issues.
Okay, so what are the action points on that? Because I think that if we had our farmers, 20 years ago getting inputs and access to credits that was affordable, maybe we would have be dealing with hardcore multinational commercial farmers as opposed to still commercial farmers.
So you need to provide them financing, indeed.
Yeah.
That's where we can play a role. You need to have that cooperation between private sector and public sector. And you need to invest into infrastructure as well.
Yes, yeah.
Starting by infrastructure, the point here is that investing into infrastructure is going to help Africa to gain into competitiveness. That's the main point. That's what we need to do. If we do that, we add additional funding, then we can begin to have impact on lives of Africans.
Bertrand, welcome. It's so good to have you on. Look, you're the former CFO at the World Bank, and how are you seeing
what is going on at the moment?
We are in a deep crisis, let's face it. I mean, we can be positive, etc., but it's very tough. It's tough economically, it's tough socially, it's tough geopolitically, from whatever perspective you take. But I think what is important for the macroeconomic is a long-term perspective, the mid to long-term. How do you prepare for the future? And what gives me hope is that Africa, for the 21st century, is not part of the problem, is probably at the heart of the solution. The demographic issue of the world, the carbon issue. I mean, that's in Africa where you can offset carbon. That's in Africa you can produce the necessary hydrogen that is needed for the transition. That's in Africa you will find the rare earths, etc. So a lot of things will happen in Africa.
Georges, great to have you on. I have to ask you, as an African working at a multinational bank, I'm curious to find out what conversations you have about perceptions of risk.
First of all, governments need to play their part in readjusting their expenditure to and revenue equation. We've seen a number of governments taking certain measures already by way of subsidies or reviewing the cost of government expenditures and so on. But there are other things that need to be done, and that's where the international community could come in. We need to look at the cost of debt, which is today weighing very heavily in the balance sheet of our countries.
I want us to be realistic, because we're talking about these macro issues, right, and how to solve them. We've been making changes, and I agree that we're seeing huge shifts. But this tectonic shift that we're on the cusp of huge efficiencies in agriculture, what do we need to see today?
We have to be first to persuade ourselves and then to persuade the others that Africa is critical for the 21st century. I think this is the starting point. This is important, and that it's not Africa that is designed, but Africa is self-designing itself as central for this century.
This is the time for Africa to actually get some sort of its independence in many aspects. We need to rely more on funds that are raised out of the continent versus external debt. We do have a lot of potential on the continent. We can develop our capital markets to actually tap into that potential to raise funds to finance those critical projects that the continent needs to make the next leap.
After being kept apart for so long and engaging in discussion virtually, you can feel the excitement of people coming together once again, connecting in person. Now, in the backdrop, a stark reality of many challenges facing the continent, but many CEOs tell me it's nothing that they can't contend with if they focus on the priorities. If you'd like to see more of our stories, you can check out our website. From me, Eleni Jokos, here in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, let's stay connected.